Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt, for this special episode. We'll cover Chanukah. Chanukah is coming up in a couple of days. People will be listening to this on Chanukah, and we want to discuss the Chanukah Omission. No, there isn't a special Shmuel Kunda tape on this topic that I know of, but this is something which is discussed for many hundreds of years. Why is there no Mesechtas Chanukah? So this episode, you probably can make a straightforward Birchas HaTorah on, because we will discuss some real Torah topics. It's not just going to be history, but a lot of history, a lot of Sfarim, and learning about new people like we do all the time. Rabbi Brodt, how are you today?
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so you could dive right in. Why is there no Mesechtas Chanukah?
Okay, so first like this. I would like to talk about this topic as relates to Chanukah. Now, as normally, it's a topic that's spoken about. Chanukah has a crazy amount of literature, like all other Yom Tovim. Constantly new works are being published every year, even this year. I fell into the rabbit hole of Chanukah many years ago, and the rabbit hole of this topic, and I have not come out. At one point, I was even hoping to publish a Sofer about it. I still hope to, but it's still in progress. Today, I would like to present some of the materials I've discovered over the years. I can't bore you with all the materials. I have some Rachmanis. Okay, now, the general topic is the omission of Chanukah in various early sources, specifically in the Mishnayos, where there's no Mesechta devoted to the subject, although, as people point out, sprinkled in different places, there's some mention of the Chag, whereas, let's say, Purim, a parallel Chag, it has Mesechtas Megillah. So the question is, why is that? Many answers have been given. Today we're going to discuss a few, and the discussions that lead from the different answers. One, as I like to always quote in the outset, there's lots of collections about it. Only one I'm going to mention is from Moshe Tzvi, who wrote a very useful article. Later on, at some point, it was even translated into English. There are academic articles that help for this whole story, but today I'm not going to be using too much from them for today's presentation. Okay. The hope is to present some solutions, some that have been said, and some maybe build off others. First, as a general thing about Chanukah and omissions, there's a lot of omissions of Chanukah. What do I mean? A lot of people ask, this is also a famous question that we're not going to deal so much today, but we'll mention a little bit about, is in HaNissim, there's no open mention of the nace of the Pach Shemen. Why is that so? We'll return to it possibly at some point. Another omission is even the lashon of the Gemara, when it talks about Chanukah, and it talks about HaNissim, it refers to HaNissim. It doesn't say the words HaNissim openly. Lamashal, the famous Gemara that everyone quotes, my Chanukah, the Tana Rabbanon, and we'll be discussing this brisa. So it says after it says Batku v'loy matzu al Pach Shemen, and then it says v'loy by halak yamecha nasa by neis v'likum ren shmeinis yam. Everyone knows this Gemara, and then what does the Gemara say at the end? L'shana acheres kavim v'asum yam toivim b'halo v'ayda. Rashi says, "My Chanukah al ezen eis kavu," and then Rashi says, "Hachi garsina v'asa yam toivim b'halo v'ayda loish asurim b'malacha shalonikvel lekreis halel v'loimer al HaNissim b'ayda." That it means to say in Haida we say al HaNissim. Now, why does the Gemara say this? Okay, Lamaisa. Later on, the Gemara, when it talks about Ma'ul Haskir Shel Chanukah Beberchas Hamazon, what's that referring to? Again, Al HaNissim. Why doesn't it say the words Al HaNissim? Also in the Tosefta, in the Yerushalmi, it doesn't ever use the words Al HaNissim. Very interesting. I'm not sure why that's so. Who's the earliest? When we have the Shiltis, which we spoke about in previous episodes on Chaim Kanievsky, he uses the words Al HaNissim. Now, even then, the actual nusach, you have to wait till the Mesechtas Seifrim, who has it in short form, and then you have to wait till Rishonim, who bring down the whole nusach of Al HaNissim. Another omission is even after we have this Gemara, the Gemara is still strange a little bit. Why? It says, L'shana acheres kavim v'asam yam toivim b'hal v'ayda. But what about Ner Chanukah? It doesn't say that L'shana Acheres that you also have to light. It talks about what do you have to do? You have to say Hallel and say Al HaNissim. But the main thing that at least that we do is light Neiris Chanukah. So this question already is handled by many. Just to mention, we're not going to go into this specific question, but this the Big Day Kahuna, a mechibur which Rabbi Kiva right away in the Gilyon Hashas and Shabbos right away is Mitzayin to the Big Day Kahuna. The Big Day Kahuna has a massive arichos from a few hundred years back. He writes on the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi wrote on Hilchas Chanukah on the Smag. So this Batekuna has dozens of issues going through the Gemaras and the Sugyas of Hilchos Chanukah. I would say it's something close to 50 different issues. He's mafalpel in it. Now, the Sofer has been printed once or twice. You can find it in Hebrew books. But more recently, someone published about 10 years ago, it looks like this, a paperback, and his name is Menachem Adler. He's written Reb Menachem Adler. He's written a lot on Chanukah, and he goes through this chibur of the Batekuna Be'iyun, and the chibur is incredible. And he's on everything about Chanukah, a lot of lumdus, a lot of all different things. And one of the things is he asked this question, deals with it. Okay, but I'm just mentioning it now because we're not going to really get back to dealing with every single aspect of the Gemara. Another question that people ask is an alamichya. We say alamichya and we don't say any mention of Chanukah. If it's sort of a yantif, why not? Another point that people point to is in Yerushalmi, there's kemat nothing about Chanukah. Even the Bavli, the Bavli does have a few blot. Everyone knows many people they spend Chanukah learning these sugyas. There's kemat nothing in Yerushalmi. Is there any reason for that? Another point people point to is the piyutim of Eretz Yisrael of Chanukah. There's no mention of Pach Shemen. Similarly, early chiburim such as the Sefer Maccabim Chilek Aleph, which is very, very early, which in recent years a beautiful edition came out, looks like this, with haskamas of many gedolim such as Reb Shlomo Fisher and others, and it helps one go. If Zalman Chemi Goldberg gave a beautiful haskama, Yitzchak Yeshai Weiss from Bnei Brak, it's a beautiful, beautiful edition with pictures with Aderes, and one goes through it. You agav get a very meyerdika understanding of what happened in Chanukah, but you'll be surprised to see there's no discussion of the Pach Shemen. Another point people ask is in the Zayar, there's no mention of Chanukah. And then the last point is in the Rambam. Everyone discusses Barichos, the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, and he talks a little bit historically. And his first halacha in Hilchos Chanukah, and the second halacha, when he talks about we lighting candles, he doesn't even quote the Gemara in Chanukah that we just quoted, which says, Nasa by Nes, Veliko b'Mena Shmini Yom. Why he's also seems to be not talking about this thing. Okay, anyway, these are all the omissions. We're not going to be dealing with all the omissions. I'm just pointing out that the omissions of Chanukah are very glaring on some level in many different early sources, different omissions. So this is the Hagdama of the episode.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Brodt. Rabbi Brodt did not ask me to say this, but he always mentions that he has this Sefer is about to put out, wants to put out, needs time to put it out. So anybody, feel free, reach out, send them an email. I'm sure he could use, it needs time for it also, but I'm sure funding can help get these wonderful Sfarim out. He could tell me that I'm wrong, but that's how it goes in the book industry.
Definitely funding is necessary. That's for sure. Yeah.
Anyway, so you can become famous together. Whoever wants to participate can become famous together with Rabbi Dr. Brodt. Another interesting piece of information. You mentioned different Sfarim. I know Nachi Weinstein on the Sfarim Shadow podcast has had discussions with different academics about different various works that have come out on Chanukah. Discussing them, what information is missing, what information is not missing, what's there, what's not there. Might be interesting to check out for some of the listeners. Anyway, okay. So who asked this question? You touched upon it a little bit, but let's get into the ones that you want to focus on that discuss the Pach, or the question of why is there no Mesechtas Chanukah?
Right. So it basically is Rabbi Yosef Cairo. He asks this in his Chibur Magam Esharim. Now, it was pointed out to me many years back by Professor Shneir Zalman Lyman, but it's not in the Magam Esharim in the standard pieces of Magam Esharim. It seems there's manuscripts of it, and in a piece of a manuscript, it seems he's asking this question. So it's cute. Everyone knows what's the most famous question about Chanukah is why it's 8 days. It's famous for being the Beis Yosef's Kasha, even though it's much, much earlier. We might have mentioned a drop about it today. And this question also, at least the first person that talks about it openly is the Beis Yosef. Anyway, another person that talks about it is the Chavas Yair. The Chavas Yair, the Chavas Yair who dies in 1702, was a tremendous, tremendous guy. And he was also very interesting guy. A lot of his material did not survive, but we have some like a mafteach of some of this massive work that he had on Kol HaTorah Kula and every type of thing possible, and it was printed. A few pages are printed. It's called Yair Nesiv. It's 4 or 5 pages printed in 1865 from manuscript. It's incredible what you see, what he was going to deal with in this work that has been lost. So one of the things he talks about is Tzarich Tam al Rebbe b'Seder Mishna shaloi zacher prati dini tzitzis utfilin v'netilas yadayim v'ner Chanukah loy zacher klal mashen came b'Megillah ve'irvin. Now it was printed in a journal called Base Medrash that came out in 1865. At one point it was even photocopied, but anyway, the point is not, we don't know what he says, but he asked the question also. Now, Adkan, the two early sources that asked the question, and then basically the next source that I believe that I located asked this question is a contemporary of the Chida in 1802. He asked this question in a Chuvas Edis B'Yosef that was actually also printed in maybe in 1800, and this Sefer also was recently reprinted, and he has a piece about this topic, and we'll get to his answer shortly. Now, the truth is, as I mentioned earlier, all different omissions of Chanukah, but the omission of Pach Shemen created a great controversy in different periods of time. In 1891, a Yid named Chaim Zelig Slonimitsky, he wrote an article in the newspaper Hatzvira, questioning why in the early sources, such as Sefer Maccabiyim, Mechashbenoim, and all these things, there's no mention of the Pach Shemen. What's pshat in that? That's the question that he wants to know. Okay. And he deals with this, and basically he also asks about the Rambam, and basically he says he has different suggestions about it in his article. We're not going to go into what he suggests, and this ended up being a series of articles in the newspapers and his newspapers. Mamish was a controversy all over. Everyone was writing about it. Complete svarim were written about it. But even a fellow from Maskil, Yakov Reifman, even a fascinating correspondence of his with Aderes, he wrote very sharply against him. Is what's he suggesting, that the nation of Pach Shemen, that it didn't happen just because it's not mentioned? Maybe there's another reason behind it. But anyway, now it's assumed that this Slonimitsky, he's an evil Maskil and he had evil intentions with it. It's clear that he wasn't an evil Maskil. Without getting into a conversation of what is a maskil, if there's different types of maskil, he's a frum yid who spent years working, and he was consulted by many gedolim because of his expertise in mathematics and astronomy. But after he wrote this article, which was towards the end, it seems it went downhill for him, and he was put into a different category. Just to mention one autobiographical account, a Yid Tzvi Hirsch Molinsky writes how he met him after this article was written, and he said he knew that the responses against him were very sharp, and they didn't like him. But some people actually wrote defenses for him, such as a Yid Reb Shmuel Alexandrov, who was in close correspondence with Rav Kook. But because of his correspondence with this and defense of Slonimitsky, a picture of him circulated on the bottom. It said that he's a Russia. Anyway, one other point is that the Torah Tamima, in his famous work, the Makar Baruch, writes that he went to visit the Netziv in Varsha, and at some point, Slonimitsky was also in Varsha. He asked him, why doesn't he go visit the Netziv, as he had been in close correspondence with the Netziv? He said, I had correspondences with him. I really want to, but since I'm on the outs, and I fear that those against me will stop helping the Netziv if I visit him, so I don't want to go to him. And it's clear it had to do with this article. Anyway, bottom line is that he wrote this thing, and even in more recent years, this has come up, that there's no discussion of the Nes of Pach Shemen in early sources and what's pshat in that. But we're not going to deal with explaining possibly to be miyash of it, but it's already in the famous controversial earlier work Ma'arei Nayim from the times of the Beis Yosef. He already notes the omission in the Sifrei Chashmonaim and etc. about there's no mention of the Pach Shemen. Rabbi Daria Medina, in a controversial work of his, he's also a controversial person, also mentions it. Some people say, and this is how we'll conclude with this topic, is that it's a lot of times it depends on the tone of how one presents the information. For example, in a Frum Mizrahi journal just a few years ago, Hamayan, it was presented in a different way, in a Bakavadik Eifin. It's showing different Nakudis in this thing, and then afterwards in the next issue, people were very praiseworthy of it. And even though in 1891, when this person wrote it, the way he wrote it, sometimes it's about the tone, but it's a very complicated topic, and we're not going to deal with it. I'm just mentioning it because we're talking about Chanukah and the omission the whole time. It's sort of the elephant in the room. Okay, but now that Adkan for all the side points, now let's get to our main story for today.
So just to clarify, there are two things here, right? The omission of Pach Shemen in earlier sources, right? And why is no Mesechtas Chanukah? Are you tying these together, or just
no? I'm just saying that I'm lumping there's something very interesting about Chanukah that in early sources, when you find it, there's no mention of Pach Shemen, which is not for us. And then is the even Mishnayos. Why is there no Masechta? Not only about Shemen, but everything. Hilchas Chanukah is not in a Masechta. Why not? So that's the main focus of today.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned maskil, from maskil, levels of maskil. For those who may listen to Rabbi Dr. David Katz's podcast once in a while on history, Ayin Sham for his descriptions of levels of maskilim. But either way, so let's get to the answer that you want to discuss now today.
Okay, so the first answer that people give is based on a famous Rambam in Perishim Shnayis and Menachos, which basically the Rambam says, and this gives us insight in how Rabanu Hakodesh, when he wrote his when he put together the Mishna, which is that things such as Hilchos Tefillin, Mezuzah, Tzitzis, we don't find also in the Mishnayos. Why not? Nusach of Tefillah we don't. Why? Because all these halachos were well known by everyone. Even the masses, they knew these halachos. So there was no need to include it in the chibur of Mishnayos. I mean, to say the Mishnayos, everyone knows, and you learn Mishnayos, not everything is open in the Mishnayos, which is his own story, which we're going to discuss a little bit today. So things such as these things that everyone did every day, there was no... it was not written out by Rebbe. Now, it wasn't put by Rebbe. This answer was already given in 1804 in the Chibur Yad Neman. Maratzchia says it, Rabbi Yakov Reifin, who we just mentioned, and many others. Chanukah was well known, so there was no need to create a Mesechta with the halachos. Everyone knew, you light the candles, etc. Okay. Rabbi Yaakov Shor has a problem with this Rambam in general. He says, just look at the Hilchos Tefillin and Mezuzah. What does it mean they're well known? These are complicated mitzvahs. They're full of details. Not only that, some could say it's more complicated than Kriya Shema, which has its own Masechta. Brachos has a lot of Hilchos Kriya Shema. Just to illustrate this point of Rabbi Yaakov Shor, the Chafetz Chaim's son writes, his father spent months working on just 2 simanim of Hilchos Tefillin. And you could speak to people that are Isaac in the sugyas of Safros. It's a Mechsrah that people spend years on. The Sri Deyesh raises a similar point, that these halachos are full of pratim and dikdukim that people don't know. So Rabbi Yaakov Shor suggests there was some type of Mesechta that was devoted to the Halachos of Tefillin, similar to a Mesechtas Seifrim type Sefer, and it was lost. But some of it is retained in the Mesechtas Seifrim that we have today. Okay, this is a suggestion of his. Now, with all that, we could go on to the next answer, and that is the assumption that there really was a Mesechtas Chanukah and it was lost. Now, we know that there's something called Sheva Mesechtas, or known as the Mesechtas Katanos. In the series of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, I hope to deal with this at length, because Reb Chaim Kanievsky, is well known, wrote a pirush systematically on the 7 Mesechtas. However, many early Achronim did not have these Mesechtas, and many Rishonim didn't even have all the Mesechtas. But the question is, what are the 7 Mesechtas? So Rabbi Avram ben Agra quotes from his father, the Vilna Gaon, says one of the Mesechtas is Mesechtas Chanukah. Now, we have the 7 Mesechtas today, and none of them are Mesechtas Chanukah. But Bekitzer, it seems it might have been lost. The Radal seems to say that there were other Mesechtas besides the 7 Mesechtas. He has the Makayos in Shuvas HaGaonim. Interestingly enough, the Vilna Gaon's great nephew writes that he heard from the Vilna Gaon that there were not only were the other Mesechtas, such as Mesechtas Chanukah, there was something called Mesechtas Midas, Mesechtas Anava, and Mesechtas Bitachon. All these Chiburim were lost. Anyway, So this is a different answer, that there might have really, according to the Brodt, there was such a Masechta, it was lost. Okay, now this really leads us into the next answer, and which is that there really is a Masechta about Chanukah, and that Masechta is what? Megilat Tannis. Who says this? So earlier I mentioned there's a Chibur Aderes B'Yosef. Aderes B'Yosef, printed 1800, who I said he's the earliest source that talks about this question in printed sources, besides the 2 that I mentioned that are only recent discoveries. And he brings down that, and the Chidah goes with this also, that there was no need to write a Mesechtas Chanukah, because if you open up Megilas Tannis, in the end of Megilas Tannis, there's a ganze parak, and in there it talks about, and we're going to see more about it in 2-3 minutes. It talks about Chanukah, and then after it brings down Chanukah be'esrim v'chamisha be'yom Chanukah, and it talks all about it, and then it talks about and then it has a whole There's a few pages in some versions of the Chibur, but there's all the halachos, even mitzvahs halakha from Shkia, and leave it out Pesach Beisai and V'mayidar Ba'aliyah. So we see there's a bunch of halachos in a Mesechta, early Megilas Tannis, early Sofer. Now, interestingly enough, in 1908, there was an edition of the Mesechtas of Megilas Tannis, and he says this answer also, that he didn't know that other people said it, and then he says that on the cover of this printing edition in 1908 that he publishes, he says Megilas Tannis v'nochen liyachsel l'shem Mesechtas Chanukah, because of this last parak, he holds, and he could mistakenly think it's Mesechtas Chanukah. Okay, there actually is a Mesechtas Chanukah, but turns out it's really a parody, a Leitzanistic work printed, but we're not going to get into that now, what you can learn from that. Anyway, a few years back, this chibur that came out in 1908, called a Pirush on Megilas Tannis, one of the Pirushim is Ha'eshel and Ha'eshel Avram. So Oz V'Hadar published it, but they, for some reason, they censored out certain haskamas, and they censored out half the Pirush. I don't know why. Okay, more recent years, Oz V'Hadar published it, and they published the whole work. It looks like this, and they have some other Pirushim on the Masechta. Now,
1 second. You said Oz V'Hadar published it and censored it. Then you said they published it.
No, Zichron Aaron. Sorry. Correct. I'm testing if you're listening. That's all. Zichron. That's what they always say, right? Zichron Aaron, publishing house, they published it with including everything. Okay. Now, Reb Chaim
Again,
Berlin,
to clarify, one more time, Oz V'Hadar published
censored
it.
They censored it, and Mechon Zichron Aaron did not censor it. They published the whole thing. Okay. Now, Reb Chaim Berlin, he was in Yerushalayim at the time, he helped the author, including giving him rare materials from his incredible library. He even tried to get funds for publishing by Mekitzin Damim. This author spent 4 years working on this parish. It's a very nice, thorough parish on the thing. And he says this is what, bottom line is, today this parish is available. It's available on Hebrew books if you don't want to buy the Zichron Aaron edition. But he suggests that's what the Gra means. The Gra didn't mean that there was a lost Masechta. The Gra was well aware of Megilas Tannis because he wrote even Ha'aros on Megilas Tannis, and that's what he's referring to. Okay. Now, even if the Gra didn't mean like this, but there are clearly certain people that understood to answer this question based on the concept of that Megilas Tannis is what we're referring to. Now, and therefore, since Megilas Tannis is an early work, so Rebbe didn't need to include it in Mishnayos if there's a few pages in Megilas Tannis that if you open up your Megilas Tannis, okay, it's not a few pages in addition that doesn't have Perushim on the side, but it's a nice page of the most important aspects. Okay. But in order to properly understand this answer and why this answer is not a good answer, one has to backtrack a drop. We're not going to go fully into this, but we're going to mention like this. What is Megilas Tannis? When you learn Gemara, it comes up very often. What is Megilas Tannis? So basically, Megilas Tannis is our earliest written halachic text. And I stress the words written. Dating from much before our Mishnah. Some say it was so well known that even children knew it by heart. It collected days of when HaNissim happened, of Nitzachim in the times of Bayesheni. And basically, there are two parts. One written in Aramaic, which is a list of the various days that one should not fast or say a spadim on it. Such as, if you open up, when you're learning the Gemara over here, what is the famous Bryce? My Chanukah, the Tanu Rabbanim, Bechafei, Bekislev, Yoim, the Chanukah, Timnin, Inin, the Loy Lemispe Behu, the Loy Lezanis Behind. That basically, that's what's called the Aramaic part of the Megilas Tannis. But right away, when you look in a standard Megilas, this part of the Megilas Tannis only has something like 270 words. It's a list, Aramaic list of a bunch of days in the year. Not to fast as has been, but there's another part in Hebrew, includes, and each one of it's like a Gemara type to each one of these days, and it gives explanations what's behind the day. So L'mashal Chanukah talks all about what we know about Chanukah that you find already partially in the Bryce and Gemara Shabbos. Now, so with this in mind, it's not so strange to say that there's no need for a special Masechta about Chanukah. Since the earliest text we have is a lengthy entry about Chanukah with most important things, including the halachos, so why would Rebbe have to repeat it? The problem is that although, yes, there's an Aramaic part and a Hebrew part, but the dating of the two is much later than each other. And that is, the Megilas Tannis is from before the Mishnayos. And it has significant additions. This, what I'm calling Gemara part, written in the Hebrew, this, the Metzchayos, the Radal, I recently saw maybe even the Chasam Sofer says that the Aramaic part was written very early. At the point when it was not permissible to write down Torah Sheba'al Peh, this was written because it's just the halacha, it doesn't really say much. But at a later point, when Torah was permitted to start writing, so Hebrew was added. When did that happen? So, L'mashal, The Meretz Chai says it was after the Tkufa of Rabbeinu Hakodesh. Rabbi Yaakov earlier says it was completed at the end of the Tanaim. The bulk of the discussion regarding Chanukah that appears in Megilas Tannis is in the Hebrew part. So therefore, it does not make sense to say that Rabbi is relying on it, because this is only after Rabbeinu Hakodesh's time. The Gedolim who first suggested this answer, they were not aware of that there's different tkufas going on in the Megilas Tannis, such as which Rabbi Yaakov, which is some of these other Achronim do suggest. Now, Lamaisa, for just to go briefly into this, a few Achronim already used the Megilas Tannis for Chanukah, because there are pieces that show that the famous Kasha the Beis Yosef is already in the Megilas Tannis, that it asks it and it has its answer, and it's its own long discussion, which Baruch Hashem, there's thick works, thick tomes written on the sugya of the Beis Yosef's Kasha, but it turns out it's very early Kasha already from Megilas Tannis. Now, be that as it may, when one compares the Chanukah and Megilas Tannis to the Bavli, we find many similarities, but there are also differences. So the shaila is, which work the Bavli did the Megilas Tannis? Now that we're saying that the Gemara, what I'm calling the Hebrew part / Gemara part, that has Hilchas Chanukah in it, was that before the Gemara or after? So if you look in, let's say, the Netziv, the Chida earlier, Reb Zevin later on, they all say that this brisa that the Gemara is written after this part of this Hebrew part of the Megilas Tannis. Okay. Anyway, this as I said, there's this topic of Megilas Tannis. There's been a lot discussed about it, especially in recent years in the academic world, based on incredible discoveries. Just to mention, there's a lady, Vera Noam, put out a beautiful edition of the Megilas Tannis based on tremendous discoveries in manuscripts. And there's also Shama Freeman. They've written a lot about it, and many others. But we're not going to go into it. I'm just throwing it out there to mention it. Just to conclude the sugya of Megilas Tannis and Chanukah with two interesting, cute things. One is, we know people talk about America. So America, that to put it mildly, in the 1860s, Yiddishkeit was pretty bad. So in a book, it's called The First Rabbi, which is about one of the earliest rabbis in America, from Rabbi, Rabbi Avram Rice, who had smicha come from the Yekesh Shabbat Midrashim of Rabbi Avram Bing. So he, in a piece over here, when he talks about Chanukah, so it sounds like in 1845, he's talking about it. He's talking to his kehila. Very few of them know why we celebrate Chanukah and what it is. Okay, this is what he says. Okay. Now, what's interesting, why am I saying this introduction of 1845, is that a contemporary of his was someone, Bernard Ilo, or something. I'm probably saying his name wrong. This person was a Talmud of the Chasam Sofer, had smicha from the Chasam Sofer, and he also ends up getting to America, and he gets to America, and he's I think a Rav at some point, maybe, I'm not sure, I don't know his whole history offhand right now, but I came across this piece that he wrote a tshuva, if one could use gas for your neiros, if so to speak, the flame is coming through gas, if it's permissible for your ner Chanukah. So this is a tshuva being written in the 1860s. And part of the deal deals with how to learn up this Megilas Tannis. I found it very interesting. Even though I just said in 1845 the matzav in America is terrible, but there was a year, a Talmud of the Chasam Sofer, he's handling with the Megilas Tannis how to answer up his tshuva. And interestingly enough, in this collection that his son put out of his stuff, there's someone else, a Rav Bandi, who also he argues on it, and he has a whole arichos, again, weiter handling in different aspects with the Megilas Tannis. So it's cute, even though in America was a terrible situation, but we have two Yidden that are handling the Megilas Tannis in these inyanim. Okay, that's one point. And the last point that relates to Megilas Tannis, and this is it is an interesting little known correspondence on the topic between the Aderes and Rabbi Yakov Kahan and his rear Shuvas Toldos Yakov, where basically they're handling about Mesechtas Chanukah, Megilas Tannis. So Rav Kahana, he was bothered why the Bavli left out most of Megilas Tannis from its discussion in regard to Chanukah. He compares the two, and Aderes wrote back to him about it, that he remembers that he once wrote about it, etc. But he says what bothered him more was that the Yerushalmi doesn't, which is what I mentioned all the way in the beginning, and they handle about it. But he says, Lamaisa, there's a lot of mitzvahs that are not mentioned in the Mishnayos, such as Ksiva Sefer Torah is a mitzvah, and it's not found in the Mishnayos. Because so Rav Kahan writes back to him, and it's a very interesting tshuva how these two gedolim go at it with Kol Torah Kula. Anyway, Ad Kan, the mahalach of based on Megilat Tannis, and a tiny bit about the background of what it is, this chibur Megilat Tannis.
You mentioned these two rabbis, early rabbinic figures in the United States of America. I believe, again, Rabbi Dr. David Katz has episodes where he talks about both of them, both Rabbi Rice and Rabbi Ilui. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name either. But if you look in his podcast, he has very interesting content on both of those. Okay, so thank you for that information. The Chasam Sofer, who you've mentioned just a few times already, I think he has an answer as well.
Yes, definitely does. It's okay. This is one of the famous terutzim. Perhaps one of the first terutzim that I ever came across was like this. The Chasam Sofer says, so this teretz is brought down in the Chut HaMisholosh, that the Chasam Sofer used to say over. The reason why it's not in the Mishna is because Rabanu Hakodesh was from the Zera of David HaMelech, and the miracle of Chanukah was through the Chashmonaim, who took away the Malchus from the descendants of David. So it was not to his liking, in quotation marks. He omitted it from the Mishnah, which was written Beruach HaKodesh. These are very powerful words. And I remember the first time I came across them, I found it very interesting. I had a very close kesher with a Yid, old Yerushalmi Yid. His name was Rabbi Dr. And I asked him about this Chasam Sofer, and he said it shmekt from Haskalah. And we'll see more about that momentarily. But bottom line is, this piece of the Chasam Sofer caused controversy, like a lot of other things, and it was dealt with. There was censorships how to present this Chut HaMisholosh. People noted this in an article in the Kulmis, in the Hebrew Kulmis. Someone wrote an article about noting the different versions of Chut HaMisholosh, how it publishes. Anyway, it seems that the daughter of the Chasam Sofer is reported to have said that the Chut HaMisholosh in general is not reliable. Okay, so he says, so some people would say, okay, this is chalk it up to one more such piece that is not reliable. What he says to answer about the Mishnah, why there's no Mishnayos Chanukah. Maisa, I came across the Sridei Eish says he knew the author personally, the Chut HaMisholosh. He was a reliable person. He was a daikon, and you could rely on him. Okay, now, Lamaisa, the world expert today, or one of the world experts, because it's very hard to say, is a Yid, Rabbi Binyamin Shmuel Hamburger of Bnei Brak. And he put out a beautiful work on the Chasam Sofer called Zechrenis U'Mesiris Ala Chasam Sofer. And he says that most of the time it turns out that this Chut HaMisholosh is correct, and he defends this answer. Okay. Lamaisa, what's it based on? It's based on the Ramban, a famous Ramban in the end of Chumash Bereshis, where he talks about the chet of the Chashmonaim, that basically they took it away from. It's a famous Ramban. I'm not going to go into discussing Barichos, the quote to Lashon, but it's well known. Lamaisa, even if the one of the points that they brought up, why the Chasam Sofer it can't be, is because in Gittin he says a different reason. He says based on the Rambam that we quoted all the way in the beginning, that since Chanukah is well known, Rebbe did not include it, so it must be the Chasam Sofer couldn't have said it. But I don't know what does that mean. I remember hearing when I was a kid that the Satmar Rebbe every night of Chanukah would say another teretz, and if you, for the Beis Yosef's kasha, so this kasha there's also a bunch of terutzim. So and the Chasam Sofer is a murdik mechadish. Many questions of his, he has many mahalchim. So one time he said based on the Rambam, another time he said this. What's so problematic? I don't know. But Lamaisa, even if you don't want to say the Chasam Sofer says this, Lamaisa Chiber Chazdei Avos says from Rabbi Yitzchak Turnik from Kutna. He's the Enikol of Rabbi Yisrael Kutna. He dies right before World War II. Tremendous guy. And he says this clearly, and he ties it to the Ramban. So even if you don't want to say, you don't like the Chasam Sofer saying it, or Rabbi Yassel, it's a shmek from Haskalah. And Lamaisa, I did find years later that Lamaisa is a Chaya Frankel, interesting fellow to put it mildly. To call him a Maskell is also putting it mildly, but we're not going to get into that. He does say it. And this was the accepted explanation by many historians for many years, that the reason is it has something to do with the Yachas of Rebbe and Chashmonaim, and how the Chashmonaim are portrayed in Chazal in a negative way, not in a negative way. This is a topic that's dealt with in the academic world. We're not going to discuss that today. But Lamaisa, others have said it besides the Chazdei Avos, an interesting Yid, Reb Aryeh Leib Feinstein, which some people do call him a Maskell. I believe he's not. But anyway, Al Kolpanim, different people said this teretz of Rebbe. But there's a Nakuda, just to mention briefly, is this Teretz Chasam Sofer is telling another thing, and that is, what was Rebbe's role in writing the Mishnah? Was he an editor that just collected previous material, or he added things of his own? So Lamaisa, it's a Machlokes Rishonim. Just to mention, Rishtaya Parchi in Kafta of Ferach, he says Rabbi never brings something that he does not agree with in the Mishnah. So that goes very good. But Lamaisa, the Sefer Krisos, the Sefer from the Bali Taisis, a Sefer Klalim, a Gavaldik Sefer, he says that Rabbi was mostly an editor. He gathered existing Mishnayos, and he chose with Chachamim what to include. So it comes out that the Chasam Sofer's teretz would only work according to the Kafta of Ferach, but according to the Sefer Krisos, even if he didn't want it, he would not have a possibility not to include it in there. Anyway, this is the famous teretz of the Chasam Sofer that's been discussed. Okay, now I would like to conclude with one last mahalach, as time allows, as the clock runs out on us, and that's as follows. Some people say, let's say Rabbi Alexander Moshe Lapida says, the reason Chanukah is written down is to show the power of Torah Shebal Peh, and there's tons of Torahs and Shmuzin tying Chanukah and Torah Shebal Peh, which I'm having Rachmanis not to go down that Nakuda. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says something similar, fine. But I think there's even more to it, and that's as follows. Basically, we find in the Gemara a concept known as Chisuru Mechsrah, that when the Gemara is asked a question on the Mishnah and says something's missing, and we try to understand it, the Gemara says there's a line missing. It should really say this. So many years ago, when I was in 10th grade, my high school Rebbe at the time, Rabbi Lobenstein, he said he heard over from his Rebbe, Rav Hutner. It was done on purpose. The whole heter to write down Torah Shebal Peh was a Rasha of Rabanu Hakodesh that he saw was going to be forgotten. He didn't want it to become accessible to all. He wanted to retain a strong part of it, that it should be dependent on Torah Shebal Peh, on a Messiah from the past. Therefore, he made it that certain parts could only be understood based on transmission from a previous generation. How did he do that? He specifically, on purpose, left out lines in the Mishnayos. Lamaisa, I later found that Rav Hutner says this by Richos, and he says it for Chanukah also. It was done on purpose to retain. That's why Chanukah is only mentioned in Mishnayos in Agav Dika Oifanim, to show us this type of thing, similar to Chasuri Mechsrah. This is what Rav Hutner says. Lamaisa, without tying it to Chanukah, we quoted earlier from the Chavas Yair, an incredible work of his that only came out from manuscript in recent years called Mar Kashisha. He basically says this Nakuda to explain Chasuri Mechsrah, but not for Chanukah. Lamaisa, the Rashash, also in an interesting Chibur Nesivos Olam, from, just to throw out there, because we're throwing out these words also, in a maskilik friend of his, Rav Katzenellenberg in Vilna, he wrote many Ha'aris on this Chibur, so the Rashash says the same thing in explaining it. Now, explaining Chasur Mechsrah. But I want to take this, a suggestion, I'm going to say another point, and I'm going to take it even further. And that is like this. There's a Yid, Rav Gedalia Nadel, a famous Yid that also sparked controversy, which we hope to deal with in the episodes of Ram Chaim Kanievsky soon enough. However, based on, I'm going to take what he said and go further. He said like this. There's a famous, he doesn't say this is the background. There's a concept called Chasur Mechsrah, which we just said, which is that that there's no chesaron in the Mishnayos. You have to know how to read the Mishnayos very well. This is a Rabbeinu Bechai and other Rishonim. Rabbi Avram ben Agra brings this down from his father. He says, my father was able to show every time the Gemara says Chasur Mechsrah how it's really mavur in the Mishnah. And he doesn't just say it. Rabbi Avram ben Agra doesn't like make up something out of the hat. He gives an example of a sugya, and there's other sugyas like this. Rabbi Shlosh Klover brings down such a thing, and so you do the thing. With this introduction, even though he doesn't say it, I'm giving the introduction to Rav Gedalia Nadel. Says Rav Gedalia Nadel that where does everyone know Chanukah from? In Baba Kama, Daf Samach Beis Amud Beis, it says in the Mishnayos, if you have a gamal, I'm going to say it in English just because we're English people. But basically, if you have a camel, he's walking in the public domain with flax, and the flax caught fire from a fire that was in a shop and did damage, what happens? The owner of the camel has to pay damages. Okay. However, if the storekeeper's fire was out in the public domain, then the storekeeper has to pay damages. Says Rabbi Yehuda that if the fire was from the Neiros of Chanukah, then the storekeeper is not obligated to pay. From here, says Rav Nado, we learned the basic halachos of Chanukah. Why? The neiros have to be lit outside, over 10 tvachim, and when people are passing by. The halachos of Halo and Kriyas HaTorah are found in other places in the Mishnah. So the rest of halachos are side issues. So here in this Mishnah, which was talking about Hilchas Nezikin, we see openly all these things. So you have to, says Rav Gedalia Nadel, and this is Mamish Mahalach of his Barichos, but this is printed in a work called Likutim Mitoich Shiur of Gedalia, which it seems it's very hard to find. It's not when we discuss him, we'll maybe discuss more about it. But anyway, this is what he suggests. So really, what I'm saying is, it's not the Chasuri Mechsrah Torah is specifically in the Mishnayos. Not that the Gemara says Chasuri Mechsrah on it, but if you learn the Mishnah carefully, you'll see there's more to the story. Okay. So now I want to take this even further, and that's as follows. When one starts Hilchos Chanukah, so if you're learning halacha, and as we've mentioned in the past, I have a certain special place in my heart for the Magen Avram. He brings down a chibur right in the beginning of Chanukah for why there's a famous minig that all children are makbid in every place in all the world, which is Chanukah guilt. Where does it come from? So I have no idea. But I know when you learn Magen Avram, the Magen Avram brings down, says there's a Sefer Chanukas Habeis, and the Chanukas Habeis says that there's a minig, and the Chanukas Habeis gives a reason for it. So I remember when I saw this many years ago, I know this is pre the Oitza Chachma days and everything. I emailed a friend in Muncie, has a tremendous farm collection named Rabbi Shalom Jacobs. And he tells me, yeah, he has a Sefer Chanukas Habeis. He even made sure to get me a copy to send it to me in Eretz Yisrael. And basically, in this Chibur, Taka is the Makar for the Magen Avram. Turns out, a few years later, I start going through the Sefer. He's a Talmud of the Marshal Hasheni, and he wrote an important Chibur called Tal Iris on the Lamed Tes Malaches, which the Magen Avram quotes. This Chibur is beyond rare. Even the Chida, who in a previous episode we just spoke about, on Chaim Kanievsky, about how he saw everything and his Shem Agdolim and everything. This work he never saw, but the Magen Avram had it. Anyway, it's first printed in 1641. What's this chibur? Besides for this important halacha of that you give the kids, the poor kids, the money when they come around, what's this chibur? Turns out it's a chibur on Mesechtas Seifrim, showing mefalpel in Mesechtas Seifrim, showing how in Haneros Halalu that we say every night, all of Hilchos Chanukah are merumas. So I would like to suggest that this Haneros Halalu, it's not clear how early it is, but it's for sure from Mesechtas Seifrim. So there was a small piece that everyone knew. If you want to even go to tie with the Rambam, of the Rambam's Perishim Mishnayos, that was well known, Tfilas were well known. So everyone said Haneros Halalu. And in Haneros Halalu, if you look at it very carefully, the Sefer, unbelievable how he shows it. And it's not through using gematrias, and it's not through using hibi-jibi Kabbalah, through Pashat, learning the text, all of Hilchos Chanukah, and he's mefalpel in tons of things of Hilchos Chanukah. That's the chashivas of the Sefer. So, Bekitzer, there is a place that I could show you, even similar to Gedalia Nadal, who points to a Mishnah in the Baba Kama, the famous Mishnah, which talks about, that's how we know about Chanukah and Mishnayos. Here it's much more, because there's a few lines and there's more. He shows how everything is in there. It's kedai to look at. There's at least a version on Hebrew books. There's, I think, maybe a few versions on Oitza Chachma. Okay. Now I would like to conclude, because we asked so many questions at the outset, and even though we don't have time to go through all the aspects, I would like to conclude something with a different Rebbe of mine. This Rebbe of mine, I give him unbelievable credit. He's my 5th grade Rebbe, and this Rebbe, his name was Rabbi Yakov Kappel Halevi Berlovsky in Yeshivas Chaim Berlin, and he was he's my 5th grade Rebbe. He was my 5th grade Rebbe, and I give him tremendous appreciation. He helped my appreciation with Svarim grow. I mean, say, by the time I came to 5th grade, I was into Svarim plenty, but he helped it for the next 4 years. He helped it a lot. And he, just to show the impact, this is my 5th grade Rebbe. I'm not young. I'm not old, but I'm not young. It's going back many years. And he wrote up for us in a pen with 4 different colors, uniball pens, red, green, blue, and black, with stencil machines. We're going back. I don't have the paper here. I do have the paper somewhere, actually. He quoted a Ma'ir Drash's Chasam Sofer, which until today, and this shows you the impact of a Rebbe could have on a kid even in 5th grade. And basically it says in Chanukah, we say in HaNissim, Velikuneres b'chatzos kachecha, says the Chasam Sofer, that's the answer to the question. That's where it's alluding to the nace. What does that mean? How is it answering the question? Because they weren't able to light inside. Normally they lit inside. Here they had to light outside. Why? Because it was so tumid. It was so full of tumah. And it's winter nights, so it normally should have gone out much earlier. It didn't. That's the nace of Chanukah. And that's the Yishuv, side for the Beis Yosef Kasha. And that's the Pshat, how it's Merumas and HaNissim. Okay, this is some Sofer, doesn't need any Haskamas. This is some Sofer. Now, Lamashal, so what the Chiddush is, this is a nace and that's how the nace came known. What does that mean, how the nace came known? There's a different Sam Sofer that a friend of mine, Ami Cohen, pointed to me. It's a very interesting Sam Sofer. It talks about why the nace of Chanukah is outside, and as opposed to, let's say, Megillah, Pesach. We don't do it outside, even though there's a connection to the Pesach bias for Pesach. But he says because Pesach is that because Chanukah, everyone needs to know about it. Why? Because in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, it was Beseser, and not everyone knew. Only the Kahanim knew this. Not everyone knew this. He says, the Chasam Sofer, Haravid Besefer Divrei Malchus Bayis Sheni says this. Okay. And this Ami Cohen was asking all different people, where in the world does this come from? Lamaisa, this concept that only the Kahanim knew, it sounds like there's a Meshech Chochma and Shemais that also says something similar, that it was not such a well-known nace. It wasn't as, first, the nace of Chanukah was that they won the war and everything. The nace of the Shemen took time for it to get known. But what's the Chasam Sofer referring to? So you didn't have an answer. I reached out to Rabbi Hamburger, who I quoted earlier. He didn't have a good answer. He did send me a list of different places where Chasam Sofer does refer to historical works, but there is the famous Ravid, the first Ravid, who's known for writing a Seder Kabbalah, which is a historical work. So what's less known is he has a Chibur Deiros Olam, which is also available. I'll show one of a critical edition, as they call it, is this expensive book, and that's the only reason why you show it in the first place. And basically, he talks about Chanukah. And over there, but the problem is with the dating and everything, and it's still not clear. But it seems the Chasam Sofer it's possible the Chasam Sofer could have seen this work. But what the Chasam Sofer, how he remembered it, that's still Tzarech Bir. Where is the source for the Chasam Sofer? I'll call upon him. The point is, we now have an answer, at least one answer. There's many answers for in HaNissim, and we also were able to be zeicha to answer up to Beis Yosef's kasha, even though we said a different answer, which is that really in the Megilat Tannis, but here we're answering it l'maisa. Okay, I'll call upon him. We tried to keep it to some normal sense of time without going all over the place with all the different tangents that I could have gone to, so I'm being polite.
Thank you very much. Any questions or requests for possible PDFs or book information, please be in touch with eliezerbrodt at gmail.com. If you want to sponsor any episode or have requests for episodes, please be in touch with myself, shweidm at ou.org, or Rabbi Dr. Brodt at eliezerbrodt at gmail.com. Thank you very, very much, and we look forward to connecting once again.